Welcome back, everybody. I have Laura Northrup with us here today. Hi, Laura. Thanks for being here.
Hi, happy to be here.
So good to have you. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to get started. So if you don't know Laura May Northrup, MFT, is the author of the book, Radical Healership, How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World, and the creator of the Inside Eyes podcast, an audio series about people using entheogens and psychedelics to heal from sexual trauma. Drawing from her work as a practicing somatic and psychedelic psychotherapist, she consults and speaks internationally on issues related to the treatment of sexual trauma. Her work focuses on defining sexual violence through a spiritual and politicized lens, mentoring healing practitioners and creating a meaningful path, and supporting the spirituality integrity of our collective humanity. You can learn more about Laura and her current projects at lauramaynorthrup.com, and definitely grab a copy of Radical Healership. I just kind of read through it very quickly over the last 5 days that I've had it. And it's really insightful. And actually, Laura, I'm really excited because a lot that you say in that book is what I've been saying over the years to my clients as well. And I want to get into this more about the healing and developing a sustainable aligned business as a healer. But the first question I always ask, how did you get onto this path of becoming a therapist and specializing in sexual trauma? And, I'm curious, did you ever have some other random career that has nothing to do with this before this?
It's funny that you asked me that because a lot of times people will ask me, and sometimes even like really young people will send me emails and be like, how did you get to where you're going? And here's the schools I'm considering and, all this stuff. And I spent, I would say basically most of my 20s just being kind of wild, like really having a lot of fun and seeing a lot of music and just being in like a whole kind of subcultural experience that was all about sort of rejecting the mainstream. And then I was like, I want to do something a little bit more with my life. And not that lifestyle was not very, very fun and powerful, and actually also, deeply political. So it was really, really amazing to live in that way. But I wanted to have a career that was more financially stable. And if you read my book, you'll hear all about this. And so, being a psychotherapist is something I was drawn to for so long. I mean, even before I understood what therapy was. And in some ways, I kind of feel like when for people of my generation, when we would get sick, we would stay home and watch Oprah and watch like if we were sick from school, watch Oprah and Maury Povich and,
Yes.
Ricky Lake and all these. Yeah. And whatever, we could critique all that stuff. But I was like very drawn into this idea of, going into the psychology of people and how they're growing and changing and healing. And so very, very drawn to that. And then kind of the thing that really solidified it for me, because it's one thing to, and this is actually something I would say to anyone who's listening and thinking about entering this type of path. It's one thing to want to do it. And then it's another thing to actually like do care work as a profession. It's, there's a lot of burnout. It's really hard work. But one of the things that helped me decide that I was really kind of ready to say, okay, I'm going to do this and go to grad school and take out tons of student loans and everything, is that I worked for over a year at a crisis phone line and really, like sat with people who were often suicidal, sometimes even, right then and there had their means. And it was a very powerful experience to leave that and say to myself, okay, I may be tired right now, but this is like, I feel so like enlivened and motivated to support people. So that was kind of the thing that made me be like, all right, let's do this.
Wow. That's incredible. And I love the story about being like crazy, having fun, your 20s. I get it. There was a moment where I was like, oh, you know what? This maybe can't go on forever. But I'm curious, are you willing to talk about when psychedelics came into your life and how that affected your world to then, be on this path of being a psychedelic therapist and kind of entrenching yourself in this world? Yeah, how did psychedelics play out also in your career path as
Oh,
well?
gosh, I hope my mom's not listening.
But
You know,
she knows by now, right?
I don't know if she knows this exact story. Yeah, I mean, I was just walking down the street one day. This is like the 90s. Things were a lot different. And somebody was selling acid for $1 a tab.
Oh my god.
And yeah,
In
and
San Francisco by chance?
no, not San Francisco. That's not where I grew up, but West Coast. And I just was like, cool. I'll try that. Like, that sounds like fun. And it kind of changed my life. I mean, the first time that I did that, I I don't know if other people relate to this. I kind of felt met, like fully met for the first time in my life. Like, I felt intellectually stimulated in a way that was so expansive and kind of like I could feel all parts of myself, like my almost like a flow experience. Like, oh, all this thinking is like it's starting to make sense to me. I mean, okay, I know I sound like a person who's like, and then the paint on the wall was made sense, but it really did. And that kind of, I mean, that just like blew the door open. I was like, this is it for life. But then lots of different types of experiences with entheogens and psychedelics for a long, long time before I decided to become more in this world. Yeah.
Yeah. And then tell us a little bit about what it is you're up to now, just so we have a context for this conversation. You do ketamine therapy or
Yeah.
underground or above ground, or, and then you also, it sounds like specialize in healing sexual trauma.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, what I'm up to now is that I'm a somatic psychotherapist. And, this is actually kind of an important distinction for me because there's so much emphasis on being a psychedelic therapist right now. And sort of like how exciting and exhilarating that is. But so much of the work is actually not in the journey space. Yeah. And so I feel pretty strongly that I want to continue really identifying myself as a somatic therapist and also a relational therapist, which is maybe a less like known kind of way of working. But uh, because that is the bulk of what I'm doing most of the time. When somebody does some like a ketamine session with me, for example, it's like we're doing so much to lead up to that and then so much to kind of integrate it. And yeah, I mean, it's so important for people to understand that that's just one piece. And maybe we'll get into this too about, when people go into that work, it's very important that you're not only honing your ability to sit with somebody, but that you're really honing your ability to do all the work that makes that journey meaningful. If you're going to work with people long term, if you're just going to sort of like run a ceremony and you're not doing that other work, then that's a really different thing. But if you're being a quote psychedelic therapist, which I would put into that category that you're doing longer term work. Yeah. So, and just, yeah, for context, I put my podcast out in 2019. My book came out in 2022. Right now I'm writing a new series. I'm not even going to say when that's coming out because, it's writing. So we don't know. It could be next year, could be in 6 months. But it'll be a second, installment to Inside Eyes, but it'll be a really, really different, format. Yeah. So that's the bulk of what I do. Oh, and I specialize in sexual trauma, and I can say, basically sexual trauma is extremely difficult to treat. It's so difficult for people to heal. And I really see entheogens and psychedelics as very promising for that. I don't want to emphasize it like it's a magic pill because I think that's not true and sort of it's just misleading and inauthentic. But I do think it has a profound potential, both in that it is work with entheogens and psychedelics is highly somatic and it's also highly spiritual. And I think there's something about that that's very powerful in healing sexual trauma.
Yeah, and I would actually love to talk about that a little. And I just want to point out you were really clarifying psychedelic therapy as people that just want to sit and do nothing else versus let's say like the somatic therapy, and you mentioned relational therapy. And I'm asked this question a lot where people contact me and say, well, what do you think I should study if I want to become a psychedelic therapist, whether it's above or underground. And one of the first things I always say is like somatics, like
Hmm.
some form of somatic therapy, because the psychedelic experience itself only goes so far. And we all know that. And actually, my own journey over whatever it's been now, 30 plus years with pretty much all the medicines, there's been a lot of deep healing of intergenerational sexual trauma that, as you say, it was like, oh my God, like the layers and the layers and the layers. But the somatic piece is what actually really expedited the healing. And I always put healing in quotes because I believe like it's just never ending. I know there's nowhere to get to. But what would you say to people? Because as you probably are contacted a lot, there's everybody. So many people are like so excited to become this psychedelic space holder or a therapist or do underground work. And as I was saying before our interview, like it seems like there's a dime a dozen facilitators out there. What do you say to someone who wants to do this when it comes to training and comes to, like really being skilled enough to hold space?
Yeah, this is really tricky because I feel like I could talk about this for like an
Yeah,
hour.
I know.
I mean, so one of the things I would say, first of all, is why do you want to do this work? What are you imagining it's going to be like? And I think really inviting in your fantasy of what it could be. I think a lot of people think it's going to be, I called it like action movie therapy, where it's like, people are going to be having this like really profound experience and it's going to be so amazing. Sometimes medicine work is really boring. Sometimes it's just somebody sitting there, they're lying there, they're in their own journey. They don't need any kind of, anything from you for a couple of hours. And you're not going to like run errands. Like you're actually just going to sit with them. And I have a friend who did a whole training on it and confided in me that she's never going to practice because she found it just incredibly boring. Um, I don't think it is, boring for many, but I do want to say that a lot of times there's a fantasy about kind of what it can be. I think also that it's important to explore what it is that you are hoping to do with people. Are you hoping to simply run a ceremony for them or simply guide them? Or are you hoping to work with them long term? So if you're hoping to work with them long term, you're seeing them regularly, weekly, I would honestly just suggest like becoming a psychotherapist so that you can get the training that helps you work with somebody psychologically, or getting some kind of other very cohesive training. Maybe it's a coaching program, something that helps you understand how to work with somebody outside of the journey space, not just the journey space. But like, I mean, this question is so difficult because there's also, if you say there's like a dime a dozen facilitators, there's also a dime a dozen programs that, some of them are amazing and some of them could use some work. But the big thing I think is just getting very clear about what you're doing. And I think this is also a part where, people get confused. Are you doing spiritual work? Are you doing psychological work? These are two really different things. And just because you've been trained to do spiritual work does not mean that you're capable of doing psychological work. But a lot of people get trained to do the spiritual work and then, through Instagram and articles they're reading and going to their own therapy, they kind of pick up on like pop psychology and then they try to psychologize, you basically work in a psychological way. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous because there's a lot of layers to when we're working psychologically that you need training to do. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to be working in that way. That's a very Western form of healing to be, doing this sort of like psychological work. But I am saying you got to know enough about it to know if you're stepping into that territory and to know either not to or to get more training in it. I hope that answers your question.
No, this is great. And this is what I've said to clients over the years or just people out there in general, where I say, look, like you have to really be aware of your limitations and your training and your awareness to hold that space and then be resourced. This is even what I do as a business coach. It's like, even though I'm trained in certain things, like I just know it'd be better to send someone to this person or, like, hey, that's not my specialty. Talk to this other person, maybe have, like just really keeping your own ego in check and also knowing like, okay, if you're not really of service to this client, what are you then going to do?
Mhm.
Yes, you can try to help them through what you've learned on Instagram, which I actually just wrote an email about that recently, where I was like, everybody's a therapist because of Instagram. That's kind of scary. But I'm glad it's getting people informed to some level. But yeah, there's just certain things where it's like, okay, know your limits and know where, like to keep that space between, okay, here's what I'm able to do, here's what I'm comfortable, and also just having that awareness of like, maybe this isn't really serving them at their best, especially if you're dealing with pretty high level traumas, sexual trauma, ancestral trauma. We can go on and on. Yeah.
Well, and we talked a little bit about this before we got on this call. So about the kind of issue of transference and countertransference. And for anybody who's interested in working with severe trauma and also, doing medicine work, I think it's episode 16 of my season 1 of my podcast that's called Dynamics of Sexual Harm in Healing Relationships. It's really important to understand that if you're working with somebody who has trauma that is relational, which most trauma is. I mean, even if somebody gets into like a car accident and then and that's, and they cause the accident and it's not with any other car, let's say they hit a tree. Even the way that people react to them having been in the car accident is a relational experience that can be either traumatic or non-traumatic. So when we're working with somebody who has relational trauma, part of their healing often entails them attempting to interact with you where they're recreating their trauma. So they're viewing you as the perpetrator, they're viewing you as their savior, they're viewing you, as the person who abandoned them, and that's why that they experienced the trauma. This is all transference, and that's the sort of psychological word for it. And that's all okay, right? Like, that's not wrong that when you work with someone, they feel those things toward you. But a lot of times when people don't have psychological training, but they're working in a psychological way, they feel that that's really annoying, that it's inappropriate, or they feel that it's true. Like, ooh, I am your savior, or maybe I am perpetrating you. And being able to work with somebody's transference in a way that's really containing and supporting them to move through it and explore what it means that they feel that you are, going to abandon them or whatever the thing is. That is the psychological work, as opposed to actually entering into that enactment with them and then trying to actually save them or actually being the perpetrator, and et cetera, which is where you get into, unfortunately, what's happening a lot in the field, which is a lot of abuse.
Yeah.
Or
And
boundary crossing.
yeah, boundary crossing. And I'm glad you brought this up, because there's actually a lot of opportunities to heal with this when there's that awareness. I actually said this to my own therapist recently. I was like, oh, she got the times mixed up, and I was like, oh, this is so good for my abandonment wound. Like, let's work on, I mean, it's like I'm at that point where I can joke about it, but 15 years ago probably actually would have triggered me into this state of like, this means you don't care. This is the same thing. And this is where there is an opportunity, but I think there's some people at a certain level where they actually don't know. And we're seeing this a lot, the whole savior, the egos. A lot of people have been talking about narcissism in the psychedelic space. And I'm sure we're going to just come up against more of this, especially as it explodes. And now there's MDMA coming in, and, people going through very short training programs. We'll see what happens. I try to really take the stance of non-judgment, but also education. Just like, okay, what can I do? I can't control what's happening, but we can share our voices and try to stay educated.
Yeah, I feel worried about psychedelics becoming more widely available because of all of this, because I there are going to be people who are treated very poorly by the people they work with. And meaning there are going to be sort of like clients or patients that are treated very poorly by their guides or their therapists. And so I'm very concerned about it. And all I can say for the people who are thinking about becoming guides is this work requires a lot of skill. I think a lot of people think it's just pressing play on a playlist and sitting around while somebody is just like, wow, I'm having an ego death. But it requires an incredible amount of skill. And there's so many people who don't. I mean, I hear this all the time. Like, I don't want to take a 2-year training. I don't want to take a 4-year, I don't want to train. And I'm just like, if you want to sit there with somebody who is doing some of the most powerful work of their life, maybe even some of the most powerful work that will happen for generations in their lineage, what's up with you that you don't want to get serious training? Because it's the other thing about the potential for healing is that it always coincides with a potential for harm. So there's an incredible amount of vulnerability that's needed to do something that's extremely healing. And that means that there's actually an incredible risk of it not going well. And yeah, if you just, it's like you really have to be honing and working on yourself. So I hope that the people who are becoming guides will do their best to get lots of training. And then to people who are running training programs, I am just really encouraging them, don't graduate people, don't include people in your training program that you don't think are acting in integrity. Just say no.
Yes, thank you for sharing. And I want to point out, you mentioned one thing, doing your own work. You just said that a little bit, and we talked about this before, where there's also this aspect of me and Laura we're kind of joking beforehand about should facilitators be made to have like at least some hard experiences, and I'm like, I don't understand how someone could even hold. I mean, this is super my own projections of my own judgment. I don't understand how someone could really hold that space without having some challenging experiences and having their own deep work that they've done, because how is it going to work for your client? Is it really going to serve? Like, what if your client enters into a place you can't even understand? This has come up a lot, when exploring, like, do psychedelic therapists need to even do psychedelics ever? That's like a whole other thing. But what are your views on that? Like, doing your own work to then be able to better serve?
Yeah, I mean, the simple of it is I agree. People need to do their own work. I think that it is possible to do integration support work and not necessarily have a complete understanding of the type of medicine somebody used. Just the same that there's a lot of things that you work with, let's say, as a therapist, where you don't have the exact experience that someone's gone through. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to do some kind of work, both in terms of training and in it, being able to work spiritually, being able to work psychologically. If you're doing that, if you're working somatically, which I think a lot of psychedelic work is very somatic, and being able to sort of think in that mythopoetic realm, being able to understand a lot about what the experience is. If you're not actually going to try it out, doing the consultation, doing the research, really starting to understand, like, what are people actually doing in this space? And, I think that meditation can be pretty psychedelic. So I'm not saying, you have to ingest X, Y, and Z substances in order to help someone with integration. If you're going to serve a medicine, yeah, you need to, I do think you need to know what that experience is like. I think you need to have a pretty intimate relationship with it. So yeah, that's kind of my stance on that piece. And then in terms of doing your own work, even if you aren't a psychedelic practitioner, any kind of practitioner, if you want to help people heal, you make a lifelong commitment to honing yourself. You are the instrument, honing yourself. And that means that you do a level of healing that, frankly, you might not want to do. And that means that you are willing to do very, very hard things. And most people who have severe trauma do have really hard journeys. I think people who have less trauma sometimes don't have hard journeys, but oftentimes do as well, on all different kinds of medicines. And yeah, I think you've got to be willing to walk in the underworld if you want to be an underworld guide. And that's what a lot of this is sort of being able to traverse spaces that are, infuriating, disgusting, tremendous grief, like all these, that's what a lot of us don't have a hard time having a good feeling. What we have a hard time with is having really painful feelings. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, and I totally agree there. Now, you mentioned a couple times burnout, and I know you addressed this in your book, Radical Healing. And this is something I've run into for years as a business coach, where especially even therapists, and I'm not even talking about psychedelic therapists, just regular therapists, And then, holding space for sitting for 5 hours at a time. This does seem to be a potential issue where it's like, maybe it gets boring, or maybe therapists, in order to make a decent living, have to see so many people. I've even actually done, a whole spreadsheet on, okay, in order to make psychedelic therapy sustainable for both the practitioner and the client, which is a whole other thing, we can't seem to find this happy medium, because in order for the space holder to make a decent living, it's a lot of space to be held. And that could lead to a lot of burnout, which then wouldn't serve someone. I don't want to sit in a space with a burnout therapist. I also don't even want to talk to a burnout therapist and pay for it. So what do you suggest to healers, coaches, therapists in this realm to get this balance right? And how are we going to figure this out in the psychedelic space?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things where I just want to highlight 1,000 times over. This is capitalism.
Yeah.
This is not your fault that you're burnt out. This is capitalism. I once had a friend ask me, how many people would you see in a week if we weren't living in capitalism? If this was just like, it's whatever, 1,000 years ago, I'm living in a village. Yeah. You're holding your finger up and saying one, but
one, maybe max.
I think my friend said 4, I was like, yeah, maybe 4. Like, I don't know, maybe like I don't know, maybe I really have no idea.
Depends which medicine, I guess.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And well, this person was asking me for therapy, like how many sessions.
Oh yeah. Therapy. That's another story. Yeah.
But, oh yeah. 1, if I was doing, one for medicine sessions, cause those are long. But so, it's an interesting question to ask yourself. And actually it shocked me when she asked me, because I hate capitalism. I'm critiquing it all the time. And yet I never had thought to myself, what would I be doing if I was doing this? How much of it would I be doing? So yeah, it's normal to feel burnout, because you're trying to solve a dilemma that is outside of you. It's not actually that solvable. What I will say is that part of why I think healing work can burn us out is if we don't have enough holding ourselves. So really being held in community, being held by the practitioners that we see, not having enough training. So much. I'm 11 years in as a therapist, and so much of what I do every year is get more and more clear about not overworking. I mean, it's really just such a delicate balance of like, oh, I don't need to do this thing right now, or I don't need to take responsibility for that thing here. This is a part where this is your job, or this is a part where, I can just interact in a way that is so much more easeful. And still, like, burnout's real. So those pieces. And then the other thing I would say about sort of like burnout and kind of this idea of like individual psychotherapy is that we're not meant to be this alone. And, it's complicated. I am a psychotherapist and I do individual psychotherapy, and it's about community. We need more community. I think people are realizing this more as the pandemic, has occurred, that isolation is actually quite bad for you. But there's so many things that people do in our daily lives, myself included, where we're kind of trying to solve a problem, but we're not even realizing that the origin of it is just being really disconnected. And that's another layer of capitalism, is that, and I don't even need to go in and explain like how we became so isolated and why capitalism wants us isolated, but that is true. You can read some books about capitalism if you want to go down that route. But so this is sort of and I'm questioning this in my own career. Like, how am I going to do more and more work? I've been getting more into retreat work, but like, how am I going to do more and more work that supports people to actually just be in community? Because they need that. They need that. We need that. I need that. It's not healing to be this isolated. It's not healing to kind of sit around and be like, okay, I've got to build my own home and my little fortress and my little family and not really interact with people outside of that. Mm-hmm. And then you go do these medicine journeys and you're like, why am I still depressed? I don't know. Do you need friends? Do you need to be held? Do you need to dance and be joyous and in a space that feels warm and, nonviolent? Yes.
Yep. The general disconnection that so many people feel. And yeah, I actually, I pose this question to my clients all the time. the way I word it is if money didn't matter anymore, because I'm convinced that this might happen in our lifetime, but maybe it's just wishful thinking. I said, what would you be doing? Because that's really your mission. It's like you should be called to this at a level where if money didn't exist, you would still be doing it. Because it's like, what if money didn't exist, or what if everything did come crashing down? It would be this all hands on deck situation, and we would be called to help one another in order to survive as a human throughout like the utter chaos of the entire world like collapsing into pieces. Not saying this is going to happen, but just wondering. And it's like it should be a mission that's driven so much from that place in your heart where it's not there to burn you out, and you're not driven just by the money. And by the way, I mean, I have to say this because I've had to say it to people over the years where it's like, I don't know, I think there's some people that think the psychedelic world is just like, oh, if I be a psychedelic therapist, everybody's going to want it. It's easy money. But it's like, wow. Yeah, it's there's a reality to time, energy. That's a whole other story that people don't talk about, where it's like, okay, you're holding energy here.
Yeah.
Whether you know it or not. Right?
If your goal is to make a lot of money, I would say like go to a different field. Yeah. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I would say that for so many reasons, like, because you're selling your time, your labor, your energy. Yeah. And anyway, yeah, we can.
Well, speaking of this, I'm curious because I've talked about this since day one, and when I started interviewing people in 2019. And I know it's a common, issue, but I know you do address this in your book. But how do we make this sustainable, especially in the psychedelic world, where you don't want to? And I hear you there. Like, I don't work on Fridays anymore, which is such a big deal to me. I'm like, no, I only work Fridays, like maybe a few months out of the year. So I try to have 4-day work weeks because I can't burn myself out or else I can't serve. But, as a therapist, or especially a psychedelic therapist, there's this issue with the pricing being so high that it's inaccessible to so many people. But then the therapist needs to make good money because, the therapist can't be scraping by on, $35,000 a year, especially living in the Bay Area or New York or wherever. What is your take on this, and how do we come to terms with this and the fact that even me, I recently looked into ketamine therapy with a good friend of mine who serves it, and I was like, wow. I was like, I used to just buy ketamine for like $30 and now it's like $1,400.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this as, someone who's like, okay, the whole root of the problem is capitalism, which we all, I think, please tell me everybody knows this by now. But really it's like, how do we solve this accessibility issue?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and I think I do actually have an answer for that, and I think it ties into that other piece about community and isolation, which is that there are actually very few people who need to do entheogenic or psychedelic healing work one-on-one, or even two-on-one. Which is like one of the models that's been presented by MAPS. Is that there's two therapists and one patient. There are some people who need that, and there are especially some people who need it earlier on, or they just may really, really need that tight of a container where there cannot be other people in the space. They'll need a lot of attention. There are many people who can benefit from healing in larger groups, and in fact can actually benefit from the fact that it's a larger group, that they can talk to those other people, that they can build relationships with them. So I think that's one of the ways that the work can be more financially sustainable, both for the guide and also for the person who's the patient or the passenger or the client. And then the other thing I think is that we really need to support decriminalization efforts. And just like think a lot more about what's going on with the laws that are being passed. So, for example, in Oregon, the Horizons conference in Oregon last year was really interesting because they had this conference that was all about Measure 109 and looking at how psilocybin services are going to roll out in the state. And I won't bore you with all the details, but essentially, it's going to turn out that it's going to be really expensive. And some of that has to do with regulations. And some forms of regulation are really important, right? Like yes, if, and I'm not super into the government. Like I said, I spent a lot of my 20s being like a wild political punk, but like I'm not super into the government, and I'm not super into things being like necessarily regulated. But if we're going to regulate, that some of the ways that things are rolling out in Oregon have to do with the fact that psilocybin is illegal on a federal level, that then, there's so many different layers to this that then make it really expensive. And so things like a regulatory thing that I would support is like, here's the minimum amount of training that you should have. That's something I could support. Or as much as I don't, love the government in California as a therapist, there are requirements around things like you have to be trained in working with suicide, or you have to get training in ethics. Appreciate that that's a regulatory thing. But some of this is just making it really expensive because it's illegal. It's illegal, and then also there's so many other sort of what is the word I want to use? Like sources at play in the big pharma around the big pharma world around wanting to make these medicines really profitable. So some of this, like obviously with psilocybin, that's in Oregon, that's a different scenario, but certainly there are major forces that are pushing against decriminalization because they want you to only be able to access their medicine through the medical model. So these are all things where, as a culture, we need to say no to this. And I think that will actually make it more sustainable. Will we say no? I don't know. I don't know if we will. The underground is going to keep. The other thing I'll say is the underground is going to continue to thrive.
It will always, it'll always be
think,
there, right?
Yeah, and I think that's partly because there are aspects of the underground that are essentially like able to be more affordable.
Yeah,
because of some of these things.
God, I know it's I'm glad you brought this up. I was actually going to ask you what you thought of this, the legalization in Colorado and Oregon. Because the more I looked into it, the more I started to have a lot of reservations. I mean, it sounds really nice to say, oh, it's legal, but then, there's certain aspects of it that are actually not legal, that it's not a general free for all, which, I'm probably on the same page with you when it comes to a lot of this, which is, I just believe in full cognitive liberty altogether. I personally, if I could choose it one way, it would just be like no regulation whatsoever around the medicines. That's kind of extreme, might lead to some harm, but that's where I'm, really a fan of harm reduction education and maybe, code of ethics and standards, which, this industry is starting to talk about it, but, I haven't. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things with decriminalization is that so people access substances anyway. Yeah. So it's like, for example, opioids. Okay, opioids that are illegal. Is that stopping people from killing themselves in an opioid epidemic? No, it's not actually. And so decriminalization, I think, is and essentially in some ways like I guess it's less regulation. I think that's useful. The decriminalization. But the other thing is that if it's not illegal, you can look at someone's website and they will say, here's all my training. Here's what I do. Here's exactly how I hold this space. You don't like what they did in a ceremony? You don't feel worried about telling anybody that, hey, this person is not a safe person to work with. Right now, let's say that somebody works with a guide for 2 years, and then 2 years in, that guide does something super inappropriate with them. They feel a very emotionally attached relationship to this person. And they know if I report this person, they could go to jail. And all of their other, the people who are working with them will lose their support. And I don't know if they're going to find other support because this is the underground and it's so hard to, kind of get connected. So this person is now facing a very big question of if they're going to do anything about the harm that's happened to them. That's still the case even with, like therapists, like many people who are psychotherapists that harm their clients outside of a psychedelic context, their clients feel afraid to report them. But where I'm going with this is just like, if it's above ground and it's legal or decriminalized, we don't have to fear saying what we do. You can straight up just ask somebody, who'd you get trained by? And they're not going to be like, I don't want to say the name of who trained me because I don't want to blow up this like whole training program that's underground. They'll just say, this is who trained me. And then you know. So I'm like decrim all the way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've actually had clients who've done underground training programs. The program I did was underground, which, now they're coming a little bit above ground, but it's this weird thing, everybody's dancing around the language and what they do and what they offer and their even the trainer's background. It's like, well, how can I know what you've been trained in if you can't share who your teachers were and the level of, medicine work you've done around the world? I mean, it's, I'm a fan of just like, go for it. It's like when I interviewed Joe Moore the other week, he said, I'll be happy when I can buy LSD at Walmart, which I will never buy LSD at Walmart, even if it's available there. But he said, because, then we can actually know what's in the medicine. What's like, how many micrograms? Is it pure? Where was it made? Who made it? I mean, even me as someone who's been in this for God knows how many years, over 30 years, I actually had bunk drugs sold to me. Well, it wasn't sold to me. It was given to a friend. Back in, I think it was like 2016, I was given what I was told was mushroom chocolate. And it was a totally like a weird synthetic I've never done before. And it was not a synthetic I knew.
You're like,
and
it was just M&Ms.
Oh, I was pissed. I was like, thank God I didn't eat all that. But, it's like if we had this legalization or this decriminalization, then I could actually maybe know what was in it. Maybe there would be a package with a label, but that's a whole nother thing. But let's get into a little bit more about what it is you talk about in your book, because I think this is so important for people. First of all, what inspired you to write the book, Radical Healership? And, it's written for healers to, I think, from what I take, to be able to do this work in a very sustainable, regenerative way that's in service, not just to the world, but into themselves as well, because it's, has to be in balance. But yeah, let's talk about this and then some of the principles and what you go over in the book.
Yeah. What inspired me to write it? I have this really kind of strange story, which is basically just that a publisher contacted me and asked me to write it. I know it's
whoa.
I know, very, very
manifest.
Weird. I know. I was like, what? I actually got the email and I was like, this is a weird fake scam, but I'll respond. Like a couple months later, I'm like signing the contract, like, wow, this is so cool. Yeah. And there's another book that I really want to write. So I was a little bit like, oh, kind of, this is because it's a big deal to write a book. It's a lot of your time. And I was like, should I do this? But I kind of just, I was like, this is a really good challenge for me. And it felt really appropriate for the stage I was at. I feel like the other book I've worked on a bit. It's, I need to keep, it's not ready yet. I'm not ready to write it yet, basically. So yeah, it was kind of this really amazing opportunity that came my way. And I've done a lot of work around teaching and, mentoring and, all these different things in the realm of what the book's about. I had an online class that, is a lot of what the book is. So that's kind of how I came to do it. And then once I sat down to do it, I was like, I want to take a stance on this that feels very spiritually grounded and just like really, really politically grounded. It's a weird thing that I support people in how to run a business because I'm really, really anti-capitalist. So yeah, the big thing there is, how do we do this work in a sustainable way? How do you set yourself up to be able to do it for a lifetime if you should want to? And I also kind of see, so in the political, like thinking in a political way about this, we want people to be more well because we want people to be empowered and we want people to not be harming each other. And we want people, especially people as they have more and more power in their lives, that increases your potential to cause harm to other people. And or they increases your ability to cause harm to more and more people. And so we want people to be well. We practitioners, healers, we are the delivery system of that. So I think that's just a practical stance of, okay, then I want there to be more of us. And I want us to be able to really do it and sustain it and do it well. As you said, like, you don't want to talk to a therapist that's burnt out, I don't want to get support and healing work from somebody who is not doing their own work. I don't want to be just sort of more traumatized by them. So, so that's kind of why I care so much about working with healing practitioners and about writing a book that's for healing practitioners, is because I think it's one of the building blocks to living in a world that feels more just.
Wow. That's beautiful. And yeah, it's kind of funny what you said, because I'm like, yeah, I guess there's a part of me that feels that way too. It's like I believe in helping people with their businesses because I have this larger vision for what I want to see change on planet Earth. And to me, it's the same thing. It's like, well, the more people that are out there helping people, plus, we're in a crisis. There's a mental health crisis. There's a disconnection crisis. I mean, we could go on
Climate
and on.
crisis. Yeah.
Everything.
There's an everything.
Yeah. And to me, it's like, well, it's all hands on deck. People are feeling the call to step up and serve and help in some manner. But then it's like, how do we get this balance right? Especially, like, you say in your book, this world really values this idea of working so hard and delivering more and producing more and making more money and like getting our work out there. And it's like, how do we get this into balance? Even, especially it's like, at least I can only speak here in America. It's like prices of everything are increasing. So then everything is increasing. So then in order to afford, like even I said to someone recently, I was like, yeah, it's so interesting. All of a sudden, like all the ayahuasca circles that I'm on all the different lists for, like the prices like doubled over the last year and a half, 2 years. And it's like, well, in order to even afford the basic healing work that's part of your own journey to then be able to serve, it's kind of this like upward spiral. But yeah, how do you come to terms with what you just said around like, isn't that funny? You help support people in their business, but then you're anti-capitalist. Like, yeah, how do you, because I've gone through this journey myself. Is like, is this aligned? Like, how do you stay aligned with that, where it's like your values, but then there's the reality of the world we're in today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is that people, myself included, we really need to continually remind ourselves about the level of power that we actually have. And when I say that, I don't mean like you have so much power. I actually mean, no, we're all living in a system that is constantly trying to make us less spiritually grounded, less, capable of surviving, make us work more. And so to some degree, like sort of, all this, actually, I'm reading this book, Saving Time by Jenny Odell right now, which is such a good book, highly recommend. And it's also really affirming to kind of what I'm about to say. We blame ourselves. There's all these books that are like, time management, like how to crush it, how to, how to be a millionaire in your yoga
Wake
pants.
up at 5 a.m.
Yeah. Like all this stuff, and it's like, if you can't do all of those things, that is okay. And you're probably actually pretty normal. I mean, I just wrote this book all about this. And do I struggle with, making sure I don't get burnout? Yes. Yes. I'm out there too, struggling with it. Like I'm living in the same messed up capitalist system with everybody else. It's not like I figured something out, like some big hack that I'm like, hey, read my book and then you'll do the hack too. Cause the hack is like, we have to dismantle capitalism. And I don't know if that's going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, I pray for it and, but we will see. So yeah, first thing I'm saying on that is just like, don't blame yourself if you can't seem to manage all of the like pieces of your life. And then, I mean, the other thing I would say about it is that I think part of being like keeping myself sane in this world is being able to live in a lot of complexity. That, to be able to hold, I don't like capitalism. I also need to make money. I also don't always know if I need more money or if I can, I mean, even like when people are like, how do you set up a sliding scale? It's like, you do it. And also you might realize later you didn't do it right. And you might have to adjust it. And I talked about this in my book, like being able to kind of change and make new choices. But there's not some answer to how we're going to survive this system. There's not some answer to exactly how you should live your life. And I think it's in a sense more so actually my answer that I have to your question or to anybody kind of asking these questions is, how do you develop a stance in yourself? And then also, how do you develop a practice? So the practice of returning, so living in this system that is so oppressive, so violent, so focused on money and productivity, how do you not be so focused on that? I mean, a daily practice of it. Like, you have to keep returning to, this is not an integrity with me. This is not, I am in an abusive family / what I mean by that is a like gigantic abusive system, and I can't leave. So it's like, we all are. So it's like, how do I keep orienting myself toward human beings and humanity? We deserve dignity. We deserve respect. This is not what this is, et cetera, et cetera. Daily
So
practice.
good. Yeah, so good. So nice to have you here and talk about this. I'm like super pumped. Now I want to talk about what's kind of coming up down the line for you. I know you mentioned kind of this new book idea, and maybe you're not ready to share, but where do you envision yourself going as this space keeps growing? And of course, it's growing. It seems so exponentially and rapidly. I'm curious, like, where do you see yourself, like carving out the next space? And by the way, do you think this is all going in a positive direction in the psychedelic world too?
Okay, I'll answer that question first. No. I think capitalism is just consuming an incredible thing, and it's gonna do the same thing it does with everything, which is destroy it and take all the beauty out of it. But that being said, there are always people who are holding it down. There are always communities that are holding it down, that are going to keep things in integrity. And that's a really beautiful thing about humanity, is that while big corporations are gonna and just like money hungry people are going to, the level of venture capitalists at all of these sort of psychedelic spaces that are there, people are really trying to make a ton of money off this. But anyway, all of that, I don't think that's necessarily going to go in a positive direction, but I do think that there are people on the ground doing the good work and creating like ethical and creative solutions to living in this world. And thank the goddess for all the people doing that work, because that is so much more heartfelt, and and it's what we need to keep surviving and try to live in a more just world. But no, capitalism is going to ruin the psychedelic renaissance is what I think is going to happen. And I want to say, like, I'm not a total like naysayer on, I mean, I think it's possible people will come up with some really cool solutions in some pockets, but I just think that the sort of machine of capitalism is too big and out of control to be like so profoundly reformed just by this. And then the pieces about what I'm up to next, well, I can just share, I did get a little burnt out. After writing my book, I was like, wow, I can't do anymore. And I felt the pressure, and everybody's like, what are you doing next? And it's really, I got caught up in that for a minute. Like, oh God, I have to do something else to stay relevant. It's like, I only put this like really important piece of work out in this podcast where I did all this like emotional work interviewing survivors of sexual violence about like really, really intense stuff. There was that. Oh, then I spent all this time writing a book. Like, it's not enough, Laura. What else are you going to do? What are you going to produce next year? So I was totally caught up in that. And then, I did some of my own work, as we've talked about, and really just came to terms with, I'm at a point in my life. I'm in my 40s. That's another thing, is I'm kind of like, hitting that point where I'm like, I don't have the kind of energy I had 20 years ago. So, or even 10 years ago. So, I'm sort of like just reconfiguring how I do my creative work, and trying to make that feel more sustainable, and accept that might mean I don't produce anything for a long time. And that's okay, because why do I feel this urge to produce constantly? So I'm planning to continue working on this audio series that I think is going to be really profound. I think it'll be really, really good when it comes out, but definitely it's kind of like writing a book. I actually put it into a piece of software where I saw the word count, and I was like, oh, okay, this is the same as writing a book. So we'll see when that gets done. And then I do plan to write this other book eventually, and I'm not going to go into what that's about, but I will say that the audio series, hopefully I release it. It's about essentially going in and describing. So one of the biggest questions that I get after my podcast released is kind of like, basically, how do you do the work? Like, if you're the client or the practitioner, the passenger, like, how do you actually heal in a psychedelic journey. And so this series is going in really deep, talking about psychological concepts, spiritual concepts, and sort of like, what are you actually doing? How are you interacting and collaborating with the medicine when you're actually in the journey? How are you sort of preparing? What is preparation? What is actually integration? Like, let's take these kind of popular words and sort of break them down. So that's what that is. Yeah, hoping.
That's going to be good. That's actually really needed for, I mean, this is like the conversation I had last week where he said, well, some people believe that, these medicine spaces are all just supposed to be fun and joyous and positive. But then it's like, I've had my most profound healing breakthroughs through sitting in utter darkness and meeting the deepest grief that I can't even describe into human words. That it's like, oh, okay, that's like really heavy, hard stuff that, very few people enjoy. Like, it's not enjoyable. I'd rather be out at a party, of course. But that's like the true, like the depths of healing. And I totally get it. I think there's a lot of people that don't know like how deep this can really go. And this is very needed, by the way. And so I'm really excited for this to come out because and maybe you agree with this, but as more and more of the media, especially like the mass media, that's like, oh, just take psychedelics, they'll fix all your depression and your problems. And it's like, there's so much more to the story. It's like, how do you really get the healing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think I talk about this sometimes that, when you go on YouTube or whatever, you see people do these testimonials where they're basically still high. A lot of times they're doing a testimonial the next morning after they journeyed all night, and they're like, this is the most profound experience of my life. I've totally healed. Or you see these articles that are like, can magic mushrooms cure depression? There's no, people don't go online and sit there and say, I mean, they do it. Actually, my audio series has people talking about this, but like most people don't, post these testimonials where they're like, I've done 15 years of therapy. I've done X number of medicine journeys. I've tried all these different kinds of medicines. I've had all, I went through a big depressive episode 10 years in, and now here's where I'm at. Like it's just, I mean, it's not sexy. It's not a cool headline. And the people who I most speak to in my podcast are survivors of sexual violence. And so there may be people who are not survivors of sexual violence who will have a really different experience of this. But, generally speaking, survivors of sexual violence need a lot of healing. They generally need to do many journeys. It's not something that gets healed with one. It's not going to be something where microdosing just like completely transforms all of your PTSD. So yeah, I'm a big fan of like, let's get real. Let's get real and practical about what we're actually doing here, which is what this series is like, this is what I think about this. And yeah. And it'll be so that people can listen to it from start to finish, and they will have like, I think a lot of information about how to make their healing path like more productive, or more like get more of what they're looking for.
Amazing. Oh, I'm so excited for this to come out. Please let me know when it's out so we can help share it within my community and get it out to more people. Laura, this was such a great conversation. I'm so glad you came on, and we'll definitely have to have you on again, especially when this comes out.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Beth. And thanks everybody listening.
Thanks for being here, and we'll have another episode next week.